Hello, folks. Welcome in, welcome in, welcome in. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday morning for our End Hunger briefing. We're just going to give a few minutes for folks to trickle in, get comfortable. So if you want to get coffee, get coffee. If you need a blanket, grab a blanket, make yourself comfortable and warm. We have some snow falling in Barrie. It's very exciting. All the trees look pretty. The holiday lights are up in downtown. Lovely Vermont wintry stuff. And also just letting folks know that this is being recorded, and we are going to send out that recording later. We have emails from folks as you had to register for this event. So, I got some emails from folks who couldn't make it today that wanted the briefing, and I know folks always like to look back at the slides to take more detailed notes. So don't worry about scrambling to write everything down as we're going through the slides. It will be recorded and sent out after for you to look over. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'll probably just send a PDF of the slides themselves along with the recording, so that folks can click through without having to listen to my lovely voice.
We have a question in the Q&A. Someone's having trouble seeing the screen. I'm wondering if folks would be willing to put in the chat if they're also having trouble seeing the screen, or if maybe this is just an individual issue, and hopefully we can help Megan figure this out.
Yes, the chat is disabled, but we have this Q&A thing that works for but it looks like folks can see the screen. Mariana said she could see the screen. Michelle says she can see the screen. Great. Okay, so Megan, I'm not sure why you can't see the presentation. Maybe try bumping out and coming back in, or checking your monitor settings. All right. Cool, cool. I think I'll give it another minute or so and then get started. We got a great crew of folks on. Great, great. All righty. So, like I said, this is all going to be recorded, and I am going to send out the slides after this. So I think that we will go ahead and get started. So welcome in. Hello, everybody. My name is Teddy Wozniak. I am the policy lead here at Hunger Free Vermont. And myself and Honor Horton, our executive director, are going to be chatting with you for the next little bit about the state of hunger in Vermont. And in the past, we've called this our hunger briefing, but we are all trying to be more optimistic about the future of food insecurity and hunger in Vermont. So Honor termed this the End Hunger briefing, which I love, and I think we'll probably keep that moving forward into the next few years. So our agenda for today, we're just going to do some welcome and introductions. We are on webinar mode, so myself and Honor will be the ones who are talking throughout this presentation, and then if we have time at the end, we may do some Q&A, but we'll see how time goes. Like I said before, I will send out a recording of this, and I will send out the slides after this presentation, so you can, if you want to take more detailed notes or dive into something, you'll have that material with you at the end. So we're going to, like I said, go through the introductions of our team. We're going to talk about the cascading crises in Vermont that folks are facing economically, socially, with housing, so many things going on right now. We'll discuss the end of federal supports that were put in place mostly during the COVID pandemic, talk about the effect of the floods of July 2023 on Hunger Free Vermont's work and hunger generally, and talk about our advocacy coming up in 2024 at the state and federal level. And then we'll wrap it up. And like I said, if there's some time at the end, happy to answer any questions. So I will pass it over to Honor to introduce Hunger Free Vermont as an org and our State House team.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. And as Teddy said, I'm Honor Horton. I'm Hunger Free Vermont's Executive Director. And I think most of you know who Hunger Free Vermont, who we are, and what we do. But for those of you who may not, our mission is to end the injustice of hunger for everyone. And we really mean everyone in Vermont. And we prioritize the people who are most affected by hunger to make permanent systemic change. And you can see that in the way that we focused in on universal school meals as a solution that really addressed kids in school, a particularly vulnerable population. And that was the right fix for that. And you're going to hear Teddy, when Teddy walks you all through our policy agenda for 2024, later in this presentation, you're going to hear how we are now taking a real focus on some other populations that are particularly impacted by hunger in our state. Older folks, people with disabilities, people who are homeless, and college students. For our policy agenda focus this year. So you see on this slide our State House team and also our contact information. So Teddy and I are your contacts for our state level legislative and policy work this year. And then we also have, as we have for many years, we work with Action Circles. And Amy Schollenberger is your contact there for anything related to Hunger Free Vermont's policy work. We are your three go-tos. And as Teddy said, and as you're all, I know, very, very painfully aware, people living with low incomes in our state have really faced an incredible cascade of crises over this last 3 years and even before that, as we know. You know that we have a housing crisis in Vermont. You know that we have the second highest rate of homelessness in the country. Substance use disorder is shattering so many people's lives and so many families. The cost of living and the incredible inflation that we experienced over the last year plus. And then, of course, the flooding this summer and climate change in overall is really dramatically affecting how we live and where we can live in our state. Workforce shortages have challenged many industries in our state, and including the nonprofit sector, as again many of you I know are aware of, and our demographic challenges, the need for more people who are in their working years, and the need for us to make sure that we are taking care of everyone in our state, and in particular our oldest and our youngest. And all of those cascading crises lead to food insecurity and hunger, which is also dramatically on the rise. And that's because when we aren't making sure that all basic needs are being met for all of our families, all of our households in Vermont, the result of any gap in that is always going to be food insecurity and hunger, because food is the flexible part of the base of everyone's basic needs budget. And when people aren't meeting their basic needs, They're going to try to fill in those other gaps by pulling from their food budgets.
So just to dive into the numbers here and talk about some statistics, from the most recent UVM data, things haven't really changed all that much from last year. 2 in 5 individuals in Vermont are still experiencing food insecurity. And when you look outside of Vermont, it's a Vermont problem, but it's not just a Vermont problem. Nationally, the most recent USDA data shows us that there was a 40% increase nationally, a 40% increase in food security over the previous year, which is the largest one-year increase of food insecurity on record. Digging into that UVM data a little bit more, 62% of respondents of the UVM study indicated that the recent rise in food prices, inflation, has affected their food purchasing. And of respondents of that survey who self-identified as food insecure, 90% of them said that the increased food prices have affected their food purchasing. So not only is food insecurity on the rise nationally, prices are on the rise, that's affecting everyone's decision-making and spending decisions, but especially impacted on those who are already identified as food insecure. And of that same set of folks in the UVM data, 1/3 of respondents utilized food assistance programs in the last 12 months. And we've seen that at food banks and food shelves. We've seen that in charitable spaces, and we've seen that in an uptake in folks who are using benefits as well. And another common Vermont problem, transportation was also specifically identified in that set of data as a key challenge for folks to access these resources, and additionally identifying recertification or paperwork as a key challenge to accessing these programs that are more needed than ever. And if my slide would go, there it is. Additionally, 50%, more than 50% of respondents indicated anxiety and or depression, with 17% of those with a newly diagnosed in the last 12 months. And so we can see through that statistic how, it's not just physical health, it's not just the amount of food that folks can access that's affecting this. Food insecurity really it's an intersectional issue. It affects all aspects of your life, including mental health. And we know that there's a mental health crisis throughout the country as well, and food insecurity is directly tied to that. And talking about some of those resources, specifically 3 Squares Vermont benefits, which is just a critical lifeline for so many folks. There are over 70,000 people, around 10% of our population, that utilize 3 Squares Vermont benefits, which represents 41,000 households, over 21,000 children, and 17,000 folks over the age of 60. So as Anor said earlier, those most vulnerable population, older Vermonters, for example, 17,000 older Vermonters are utilizing 3 Squares right now. And we know that everyone who could or should be utilizing 3 Squares isn't. We know that half of folks in Vermont who are income eligible on paper for 3 Squares Vermont do not receive 3 Squares Vermont benefits. And that's to borrow a phrase, there are cascading reasons for that too. It's access, it's stigma, the stigmatizing of these types of programs and resources. So, not only are these numbers quite telling about how many folks already utilize these programs, but you could basically double it for the folks who are eligible for these benefits but not receiving them. And this is one of my favorite images. This is the Vermont SNAP Map, which is a really cool tool that demonstrates the numbers. And you can dig in, you can go county by county and dig into the numbers of folks who are receiving benefits in the different counties. And I want to specifically call your attention to, in the middle of the screen, you'll see the average monthly benefit per household. And you can see the graph go up and up and up, and then a steep drop off right at the end. And that steep drop off represents the end of the emergency allotments, which was basically extra money that was added to 3 Squares Vermont benefits in response to the COVID epidemic. And your average award if you see now, it says $317.58. That's your average monthly benefit per household. Before the end of the emergency allotments, that number was over $400. So very suddenly, while folks are still facing all of these other cascading crises, these folks who are some of the most vulnerable to the effects of these crises saw a big drop in the amount of money that they were getting from Three Squares Vermont because of the expiration of the emergency allotments. And, you know, I think thinking back to what we talked about earlier with the rise in food costs, these folks are seeing food prices go up and their average monthly benefits go down. And as Anor said earlier, food is the first thing to go. It's the easiest thing to cut. And we can see that demonstrated here. Additionally, this is just to provide some more context. The USDA is able to do some fancy algorithms and math to determine average meal prices by state and in the and then nationally. And you can see here that a modestly priced meal, which is, again, USDA jargon, but a moderately priced meal, your average meal in Vermont costs significantly more than your modestly priced meal on average nationally. So food is just more expensive. Meals are more expensive in Vermont. And the average Three Squares Vermont per meal benefit is only a little over $2. And you can see that the moderately priced meals in Vermont are well over $3. So no matter how you look at it, the math just doesn't add up when it comes to the question of whether or not we are meeting people's needs to really address food insecurity in Vermont. And this very helpful graphic, shout out to the Vermont Food Bank. They have a project called the Food Security Innovation Lab, and they put this together for us.
Teddy, can I interrupt you quickly? We just have a few questions in the chat. We have one question from Matt Levin about the age definition of children and whether that figure can be broken down into subgroups.
Ooh, great question. It's under 18. I do not know whether we have it broken down into subgroups further than under 18.
We don't, and I'm not sure that DCF is able to do that, but we can look into that for you, Matt.
And then the other question was if we have a link for the SNAP map, if that's something that's available to the public.
Yes, I can make sure. I'm taking a note right now to make sure that the SNAP map link is sent out with this presentation and such. And also, I think if you just Google, if you want to do it right now while you're listening, if you just Google Vermont SNAP map, it should come up. But yes, I will send out the link with this presentation. Great. All right. So just talking about, we've been talking around the loss of federal supports, but what that actually looked like. So as I talked about on the last slide, in April, March was the last month of the emergency allotments. So once April hit, 72,000 Vermonters saw a significant drop in their monthly SNAP benefits as Congress ended the pandemic era emergency allotments. Most households experienced a monthly loss of benefits ranging from, like I said, the average went down a little over $100, but it varied from family to family, from household to household, with most folks falling in the $100 to $500 loss of income range. But as household sizes get bigger, that's even more lost income. And additionally, the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit at the federal level expired. And these benefits were somewhat restored by state versions of this program. Huge shout out to the Vermont legislature for doing that important work over the past few years. But when you add everything together, families, households still experienced a net loss of income. And when you add inflation onto that, people are just losing purchasing power faster and faster. Folks have fewer dollars to work with. Those dollars can't be stretched as far as they used to be. And it's just another impact of the cascading crises. And here is a lot of bars, a lot of numbers, a lot of graphs, but it's really telling. If you look at the first graph on the left, that's the poverty rate for children under 18 years old. And the blue bar represents the poverty rate when government assistance, tax credits, et cetera, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, the emergency allotment, when all of those things were taken into account in 2021, child poverty was at 5.2%. if you take away those supports, or in other words, if you look at the income of these households for the poverty rate for children under 18, without that support in 2021, child poverty would have been at 21.8%. So that's a very big delta there, a 16% rise in child poverty had these supports not been in place when the COVID pandemic was raging. Then if you look at the graph on the right, you can see in 2021, child poverty fell 4.5% because of all of the supports that the federal government and that the state government had put out for families. As those supports expired, child poverty went up 7.2%, which again is a record increase. So you can look back at this graph all the way from back to 1968 and 1970. There's been fluctuations up and down between 2%. But then you get to the COVID pandemic, all these supports, the child tax credit, et cetera, go into place. Child poverty falls almost 5%. And then when those policies, when those supports expired, there was an increase of 7.2%. So, you know, it's like I said, these are intersectional issues. All of these things work together. None of these programs operate in a vacuum, but you can see when these programs ended, child poverty spiked. And that just demonstrates the effectiveness of the programs directly giving support and resources to households. And the floods. You know, I live in Barre. One of my other hats is I'm on the city council in Barre, and it was very real. It was very scary. It's still affecting everything municipalities are doing across the state, and it had a really big impact on food insecurity statewide. You know, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the trauma of the floods. There was loss of life in Barre. I know hundreds of folks across the state lost their homes, lost their businesses, lost their belongings, have been dislocated. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge how hard and traumatic this really was for everybody, and not just was, but continues to be traumatic for folks who lived through the floods. And the floods also directly affected our work, as in not just all of us personally at Hunger Free Vermont, but our work at Hunger Free Vermont shifted significantly. So the state and federal response to the flood, FEMA from the federal government, Hunger Free Vermont, state agencies, other partners joined what was called the State Emergency Operations Center, which was, if you'll forgive the term, the war room for the flood response. And Hunger Free Vermont was there to directly address food resources post-flood. So we had a disaster declaration from President Biden. We had national groups such as the Salvation Army, the Southern Baptists, and literally dozens, hundreds of other organizations came into Vermont to help. And we also had the launch of the Vermont Emergency Eats program, which was a spinoff of Vermont Everyone Eats that was specifically tailored to help get food to flood impacted households. And Hunger Free Vermont's work. We were contracted to Hunger Free Vermont staff, myself and my coworker Lachelle were contracted as Washington County Food Resource Coordinators. We were responsible for, you know, working with the folks at the State Emergency Operations Center to take a look at all of the food resources that were available in Washington County, all of the needs throughout Washington County, and coordinating different partners, different organizations, different community members to make sure that the folks who needed food were getting food, to make sure that all of the, as I said, hundreds of small businesses, of neighbors, of food trucks driving in from other states and just popping up in downtown Barre for 3 days and then taking off. We wanted to map out what was happening, what was available for folks. So we worked to connect partners with community members and everyone across the state, really. We were called Washington County Food Coordinators, but we realistically worked all across the state, connecting folks. You know, we took the motto of if we know someone is hungry in the Northeast Kingdom because of the flood, we're going to do everything we can to get them food. You know, we also were working a lot on damage inventory. There were a lot of food shelves in Montpelier specifically that were literally just washed away. And it wasn't just a matter of restocking the food shelf, it was finding a place to set up a new food shelf. And, you know, on the next slide, there's a photo of Sterling Market. Grocery stores across the state were also impacted by this. So folks who had their kitchens washed away, again, it wasn't as simple as just going to the grocery store and restocking, especially with increased food prices. We had grocery stores that were knocked out too. So I was mostly focused on the greater Barrie area, and we also had focus on the outlying smaller towns, your Marshfields, your Cabots, your Plainfields, your Northfields in Washington County, as well as up through the Northeast Kingdom, and eventually Addison County when those floods hit as well. And in the box to the left, that little green box, in the first 2.5 weeks following the flood alone, we had over 30,000 tracked meals that were given out. And when I say tracked meals, I mean that is a meal that we know where it was given out, we know by whom it was given out, and we know whom it was given to. And when I say whom it was given to, I mean community members in towns. We didn't have addresses or identifying information. That 30,000 does not include the tens of thousands of untracked mails that we saw throughout the state of Vermont. So, you know, I used that example, and it's a true story, of we just had a food truck from New Jersey show up in downtown Barrie. They hung out for 3 days. They gave out a bunch of food for free to folks, and then they left. We don't know how much food they gave out. We don't know what they had in their inventory, but we know they were there. And we also had, you know, a shout out to Neighbors in Action from the Cabot Marshfield area, who were just doing grassroots organizing and baking 16 lasagnas and setting those out in front of the church so that folks could come and pick up food as they needed. So we know for a fact that there were at least 30,000 meals given out in a tracked way. And we also know that there is an innumerable amount of untracked meals that were given out post-flood. And there's Sterling Market. And while, you know, folks worked very hard, Hunger Free Vermont, folks at the State Emergency Operations Center worked very hard in those weeks and months immediately following the flood. We know it wasn't a perfect response, and we also took it upon ourselves to identify ways that the response from nonprofits, from the state, and from the federal government could improve. Because sadly, with climate change, we know that this is not going to be the last natural disaster to hit Vermont. So some key takeaways or ways to improve in flood response that we identified was first, food resources being incorporated into municipal emergency management plans. So every municipality is required to have an emergency management plan and emergency management director. This is almost always someone who's already on staff. In Barrie, you know, it's one of the folks who works for our fire and EMS department is our emergency management plan. But nowhere in that emergency management plan is a municipality required to address food resources. So food, again, tends to be this thing that folks feel will just get figured out. And we did figure it out in the days following the flood, but there was no plan, there was no set way in any of these communities that we were going to respond in terms of food. And so that's one thing that could be incorporated quickly enough into every municipality across the state is when you're putting together your emergency management plan, make sure food is accounted for in that response plan. We also identified a need for a centralized place or system for meal request intake. You know, folks were calling the food bank, they were calling Hunger Free Vermont, they were calling the Center for Independent Living, they were calling 211 and experiencing extreme wait times. There was no one place where folks could go and just easily say, hey, I need some food help. I need some meals because of the floods. And so moving forward, having one centralized place or one centralized system to intake meal requests would be extremely helpful. Additionally, we identified a need for a state-led strategy to have robust canvassing efforts following disasters to identify households or communities in need and to determine the level of need. So, you know, people didn't have internet, people didn't have electricity, people had in Marshfield, I think at one point they had 4 bridges washed away. It wasn't easy to get to folks, and folks could not easily just get to the center of town to find out what resources were available. And individual nonprofit partners, like I said, ourselves, the food bank, etc., we didn't have the capacity to just go out and start knocking on doors when that's really what was needed at the end of the day, was just the agencies, the state, to go into communities, to have one-on-one conversations, to see the impacts for themselves, and to connect with people. So having a state-led strategy to do that direct outreach, to do those canvassing efforts, to walk through the most flood impacted neighborhoods and find out who needs what and where would be very helpful. And additionally, having a point person at the state level with a macro view of food needs and resources. So that's sort of what Hunger Free Vermont ended up doing for Washington County. The folks at the SEOC were doing so many other extremely important work on flood recovery that basically said, like, Hunger Free, we need you to come in, help figure out what's in Washington County and connect folks to the resources, because the food resources were there and the need was there, but there wasn't great coordination. And, we think that having one person, which directly ties into the centralized system for meal request intake, if there's one place to request food resources and there's one person who at least has a umbrella view of everything that's available and all of the needs that are out there, that makes responding a lot quicker and a lot easier. The good news is, going into 2024, there are so many opportunities for ways that we can improve. Everything we talked about on the last slide in ways to improve disaster response, but also moving forward, other advocacy priorities that, as Honora said, can really make lasting, permanent, systemic change for those folks who were the most impacted by food insecurity. And I think I'm going to, no, this slide is still me. The next one is that one. So when it comes to federal advocacy, the big project, the big thing that's happening with food insecurity at the federal level right now is the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is a ginormous piece of legislation that touches everything from agriculture to SNAP and 3 Squares Vermont. Title 4 within the Farm Bill is the nutrition title, which has a bunch of different nutrition programs, the biggest ones being SNAP, which is also 3 Squares Vermont. At the federal level, they call it SNAP. At the state level, we call it 3 Squares, but it's the same program, and food bank programs. So the Farm Bill is due to expire. It's typically re-upped every 5 years. And there was legislation that was supposed to pass in 2023 to just do the 5-year update. However, Congress, because it is Congress and is famously dysfunctional, especially over the past year or two, opted instead to just do a 1-year extension of the 2018 Farm Bill. So they didn't change anything. They just took what they passed in 2018 and extended it for a year. And the relevant committees in Washington put out a statement saying their goal was to pass an updated Farm Bill in 2024. So we went to work at the beginning of 2023, hoping that an updated Farm Bill would pass. And we connected, a big shout out to my colleague Ivy, who convened a coalition of partners, agencies, nonprofits, service providers, community members to talk about, what in an updated Farm Bill, what are the things that we think could really make a difference for folks? And so through surveys and conversations and meetings, we narrowed it down to some specific recommendations that we've passed on to Senator Sanders and Welch and Congresswoman Ballant's office with our recommendations for updates to the Farm Bill. And this is not a comprehensive list, but just some of the ones that I pulled out. Was allowing their SNAP recipients to use benefits on hot foods. There are just 3 words, hot prepared foods, that need to be struck from the Farm Bill, and folks could use their SNAP benefits for hot pre-cooked meals at grocery stores. So, this has been called the rotisserie chicken issue, those hot rotisserie chickens that they have in the supermarket. You can't buy those with your SNAP benefits, but if that chicken is cold and in a container in a cooler, you can. And that just doesn't make sense. So one of our recommendations is to allow benefits to be used on hot prepared foods. Also, just increasing monthly SNAP benefits, just getting more money in people's pockets is more important than ever. Ending the harmful work for food requirements, which is self-explanatory. You have to prove that you are working or looking for work to get access to some of these programs, and Hunger Free Vermont just fundamentally disagrees with that, as well as allowing small farms to participate as producers for SNAP programs. So we are additionally separate from the Farm Bill. We are advocating for increased WIC funding, as the current WIC levels are inadequate and unable to meet the obligations. If everyone who is eligible for WIC was participating in the program, there's not enough money there, and that could result from folks being cut from the program or cuts to the program overall. And Anor to talk about some of the successes.
Right. So, the work of making sure that people who are living with low incomes in Vermont can meet all of their basic needs at the same time, right? That is what has to happen if we're going to end hunger and food insecurity in our state. And this work has already begun. And, Universal School Meals is one example. All the great work that has been done by Public Assets Institute and a coalition that we're a part of, and by the legislature on expanding the state earned income tax credit and creating and then saving last year the state child tax credit. Those are critical. The historic investment in childcare, shout out to Let's Grow Kids and the legislature again for that work, the historic investments the legislature made in housing, the unprecedented funding in the state budget last year for the Vermont Food Bank, and just lifting up that while we are in this state of cascading crises, people are suffering from hunger right now, and policy fixes take time. But right now we have got to get up underneath our emergency and charitable food system, and that funding in the state budget for the Vermont Food Bank needs to be continued and increased in this coming year, because our food shelf and food pantry network in Vermont is beyond maxed out. Those numbers that Teddy shared with you at the beginning of this presentation, the failure of hunger to decrease in our state because of all of the different crises that we're facing collectively, means that we have got to make sure that more resources right now are getting into the hands of our emergency food network in our state. And then the first time ever that base funding was provided for the Vermont Meals on Wheels programs operated by our area agencies on aging, that is a program that's really, really critical, because older people and people with disabilities, they are living in their homes, they want to stay in their communities, but many of them really aren't able to shop for food or prepare food. So even if they're eligible for Three Squares Vermont, even if they're enrolled in Three Squares Vermont, they need prepared meals delivered in addition. And so we've got to continue that support as well. So these are just some of the ways, I'm not even naming all of them, that we have started this work. We are on a path, and we are actually building momentum in Vermont toward a future where everyone's basic needs are all being met at the same time in our state. And when we reach that future, we will be able to actually end hunger and food insecurity. So that is our vision and our goal. And many of you who are here on this call today, I see Amanda is here from SEVCA, and I just want to also make an acknowledgement to SEVCA for operating the Vermont Emergency Eats program and getting that up and running so quickly during this flooding this past summer. But many of us all together are working on these issues, and that's what it's going to take. So just thank you to everyone who's here everyone who is participating in making a vision of truly ending hunger in Vermont a reality. And we have, as Teddy said, we really do have some great opportunities before us in this coming year, in 2024. One of them is that the launch of a new food security roadmap for Vermont. So this was part of the assignment given to the Vermont Farm to Plate Network by the legislature, and it will be unveiled in January at the legislature. And I see some folks on this call today who participated in the process of creating that roadmap. But that is a vision of how we create food security for individuals, but also secure our food supply. So it's an opportunity for our kind of the transformation of agriculture that's being envisioned in Vermont, our response to climate change, and our vision of a hunger-free Vermont really can all comes together into one big project that we can all participate in. And then at Hunger-Free Vermont, our policy agenda this year, we are calling it Give Three Squares Vermont a Boost. And it's actually 3 different boosts. An option that's going to make many more college students in our state eligible for Three Squares Vermont, a restaurant meals program that allows people who are enrolled in Three Squares Vermont, who are older, people with disabilities, or people who are homeless, to use their benefits at restaurants to get hot and nutritious, nourishing meals, and a state addition to the Three Squares Vermont minimum benefits for households that will actually make sure that when you're eligible for Three Squares Vermont in Vermont, when you're eligible for SNAP in Vermont, you are going to get a benefit that's actually going to be meaningful when you go to use it at the grocery store. And Teddy is going to tell you more about our policy agenda for this year.
Thank you, Eleanor. So here is our Give Three Squares Vermont a Boost platform, which, as Nora said, it is 3 different policies, 3 different programs that combined will really help shore up and make sure that the Three Squares Vermont program is meeting folks' needs. So the first one, we are calling it the College Student Option. And what it would do, it would allow college and graduate students enrolled at least half time in an institute of higher education. As of right now, they must meet a work for food rule, which requires students to report employment for an average of 20 hours a week on top of their schoolwork. The state of Vermont has the authority to exempt community college students from this requirement, and we are working with the administration and other interested stakeholders to implement this option. So how this works technically is the USDA has a bunch of different ways that state agencies can interpret the rules. And the one way the rules could be interpreted would allow community college students to be exempt from the work for food requirement. So this is specifically tailored to community college students in Vermont. And my favorite part about the college student option is that there's no action the legislature needs to take to do this. It's something that the state of Vermont can just do on their own. And we are working with, like I said, we're working with the state, we're working with CCV, the food bank, and other interested stakeholders to move forward with that option, with that interpretation of the rules in Vermont. The second piece is called the Restaurant Meals Program, and as Honor said, it is a federal FNS program that allows elderly, disabled, or homeless, their definitions, to allow those SNAP recipients to use their benefits at approved restaurants or their spouse. So if you have someone who is disabled and on SNAP and they have transportation issues, their spouse can use the benefits on their behalf at these restaurants. So there is a relatively tedious process that restaurants have to go through to get approval from the USDA and from the state when the program is set up. But each state can set their own rules for how many and which kind of restaurants can participate. So, we've been doing a lot of fact finding of other states that have a restaurant meals program. And, for example, in Connecticut, it is largely Subway chains that they have decided to go with for their restaurant meals program. So there's one or two other restaurants, but in Connecticut, most restaurants that are on the restaurant meals programs are Subway franchises. Whereas the program is also active in Cook County, where Chicago is in Illinois, and that is directly targeted towards BIPOC and women-owned businesses, bodegas, small restaurants, small businesses in the city of Chicago. So once the state decides to do a restaurant meals program, the state has wide latitude over what kinds of restaurants and what kind of rules they want to set for how restaurants can participate in that program. So while there is an approval process for restaurants, there actually is quite a lot that the state can do to set their own standards. There's not a direct action the legislature needs to take to approve the restaurant meals program. Again, the state could just decide to stand it up. But through our conversations with other states, we have found that it's really key for there to be a point person within the state government that's helping to implement the rollout and launching of this program. So the legislative ask, all money has to come from the legislature. So the legislative ask for this one will be adequate staffing for, we believe it makes sense to put it in AHS or whatever other state agency could house this program, but adequate staffing for any given agency to implement the restaurant meals program, and additional financial support for onboarding restaurants. So we're talking software upgrades, equipment, actual just technical assistance in filling out the forms and getting them submitted to the federal government and getting them approved. That all takes time and labor and money. So the legislative ask for the restaurant meals program is, like I said, adequate staffing and then additional financial supports for the restaurants to get them onboarded and going. So college student option, no legislative ask. Restaurant meals, work with the state to get the program stood up and work with the legislature to get the financial resources needed to make the program a success. And then our namesake, our Three Squares, Give Three Squares Vermont a Boost proposal, addresses the Three Squares SNAP minimum benefit. So I'm going to go in the weeds for a minute, so bear with me. The USDA has different food plans, 4 different levels of food plans. You have the thrifty, the low, the moderate, and the liberal food plan. Each food plan talks about how much money it takes to be thrifty, to have low food, to have moderate food, or to have liberal food. Again, this is a federal program that we did not design. And it's supposed to show how much money households of different sizes need to meet those different kinds of food plans. And right now, the minimum benefit is calculated as 8% of the thrifty food plan, only 8% of the total number of the lowest, least expensive, meaning less food, less nutritious food plan. So, and that that calculation, that algorithm comes out to $23 a month. So if you are a household of 1 or 2, the minimum benefit is $23 a month, which is next to nothing. And the minimum benefit does not actually apply at the federal level to households of 3 or more. So there are households right now of 3 or more in Vermont that are receiving $1 or even what we call zero benefit households, which they're technically in SNAP, but they're not receiving any money for it. So the system, the formula just is not working to help folks meet their basic needs. So we are proposing to address this by changing the formula by which the minimum benefit is calculated. So the first part of changing the formula is calculating the minimum benefit based off the USDA moderate food plan. Like I talked about before, there are 4 different food plans, and the moderate food plan is the one that the State Joint Fiscal Office uses to put together their basic needs budget. Every year they put out a budget that says this is how much money it costs to meet your basic needs in Vermont, and they use the moderate food plan. But SNAP benefits are based off of the thrifty food plan, and that just doesn't match up. So step 1 is moving from basing the formula from the thrifty food plan to the moderate food plan. Step 2 is having the minimum benefit represent 30% of the cost of the moderate food plan. So as I said earlier, right now it's 8% of the thrifty food plan, which results in around $23 a month. we would like it to represent 30% of the cost of moderate food plan. You know, folks talk about that you should be spending approximately 30% of your income each month on food. Great. Let's make 30% of the moderate food plan the floor for the minimum benefit. And finally, all SNAP households will be raised to ensure each household receives a monthly amount no less than 30% of the moderate food plan for that household. So like I said earlier, households of 1 or 2 currently receive or are currently fall under the $23 a month minimum benefit. But as the federal program works, once you hit a household of 3, there is no guaranteed minimum benefit. So we want all household sizes from 1 through however many to have their floor, their minimum benefit, represent 30% of the cost of the moderate food plan for their household size. And this is where the legislature comes in because we need them to pass legislation that enshrines this formula into statute. So that was very weedsy. It's all very complicated, but the short version is we want the state to use the same formula that they use for the basic needs budget on the minimum benefit. And that means using the moderate food plan. And that means 30% of the cost of the moderate food plan per household. And we will be sending out a lot more of materials and information and one-pagers explaining how all of this works throughout the legislative session. But that is our 3 Squares Vermont Give 3 Squares Vermont a Booth platform. This is our campaign for this year. I'm extremely excited about it. I think that everything that we talked about in this presentation up until now really demonstrates the need for these 3 different planks of this campaign. And when you put the pieces together, when you're looking at the puzzle that is, how do we make sure folks are getting their basic needs budget? When you look at these 3 things together, it really fills a gap and really firms up the support that 3 Squares Vermont is giving to individuals and recipients across Vermont. And with that, thank you. Thank you for listening to Anor and I talk for 45 minutes. Thank you, as Anor said, for all of your work, for folks who have been working on this issue and all of these other issues that directly relate to food insecurity. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The work you do is incredibly important, and people are already beginning to feel the impacts of the work that's been done over the past few years. We have everyone's email address because you have to register for this. So keep an eye on your email for next steps. To sign up, we're going to have an email list for our Give 3 Squares Vermont a Boost campaign, and we will send out information on how to sign up for that email list and other ways to stay involved. So again, just thank you for coming. Thank you for being interested in this work. Thank you for all the work that you have already done. And Anor, not to put you on the spot, but was there anything else that you wanted to say as we wrap up?
I think you said it beautifully, Teddy, and I think we have a few minutes for questions, right? So if there are any.
Great. Sabina, do you think you could help? I'm just going to put this slide back up.
Yeah, so we do have a few questions already in the chat.
Great.
Let me pull them up right now. There is a question about whether hot foods means prepared meals.
Yeah, so any hot prepared food that's made at a grocery store is prohibited under the current federal SNAP rules.
We have another question regarding coordination and per issue point persons. How do you think we did coordinating with FEMA? And this was, I think, during the conversation about the July flooding.
Yeah, I think that like FEMA was in on the calls with the State Emergency Operations Center every day, and the staff at FEMA were great. And they did everything they could, I feel, to help us coordinate and to help us put systems in place to get food to folks. And that being said, FEMA is very large, very bureaucratic, and there are a lot of rules that they are trying to implement to very fluid situations, right? So like the flooding in Vermont looks different than flooding anywhere else. And then within Vermont, the flooding in Barrie looks different than Montpelier, looks different than Londonderry. So I think that FEMA did everything they could to be as flexible as they could and to get us the help that we needed, while also trying to implement a lot of very complicated specific rules to a fluid and very complicated situation. So, I don't think anyone did anything perfectly in flood response, but I know that the folks who were on the ground in Vermont from FEMA did everything they could to get us the help that they needed. And they were also, I think, very helpful in helping connect us to the other national groups. Like I said, the Southern Baptist Convention, the Salvation Army, some of the other big national groups that were showing up to help. FEMA was helpful in connecting us with them and helping us put systems in place.
Great. We have a question regarding whether Hunger Free Vermont is supporting the child and adult food program.
So yes, yes, and unfortunately, the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which is the federal nutrition program that provides meals to both child care providers and adult daycare providers, is not well designed to work with our small providers in Vermont. Its reimbursement amounts are totally inadequate, even to cover the cost of food, much less the cost of the labor to prepare the food and serve it to the kiddos. So what we're seeing in Vermont is that fewer and fewer of our childcare providers are able to use that program, even if they're eligible, and many are not even eligible because the rules of the program at the federal level are pretty exclusionary. But also they're just not finding the benefit to be worth the paperwork and the requirements. And so we're actually losing meal programs in childcare providers in Vermont. And that's a huge problem and a huge concern, because at the same time, we're expanding childcare, which is great and critically needed. But if we can't expand meals in childcare along with that, we are really going to have a new hunger crisis for kids and their families. And so that is something we are really exploring. We've been doing a lot of learning and listening to childcare providers. We have a cost of meals in childcare study that came out this past year that you can get to on our website, and I highly recommend that you take a look at it. And so we're in the process of really figuring out what is a strategy that's actually going to work, and pulling together a coalition of all the relevant partners to really think through how are meals in childcare really going to work in our state, because the Child and Adult Care Food Program, as it's currently designed, is not working and is not going to work for us.
I think we have time for one or two more, but I'm just going to put this slide back up here so that if you do have a question we don't get to, feel free to email it to Anor or myself, or both.
Yes, we have quite a few questions, but we have a question from Michael Redmond. If the new 30% minimum of the moderate plan is adopted, what will this mean for different size households, and what will the budget impact be for Vermont?
Great question. So we are still crunching the numbers on overall budget impact, but the proposal is looking to cost between $4 and $6 million per year, which I will note is significantly cheaper than universal school meals. So yeah, budget impact of $4 to $6 million a year. Again, we're still crunching those numbers. But what it means for households that are receiving SNAP benefits is that once that equation is in place, if your SNAP benefit is currently less than 30% of your household sizes, so 30% for a household of 5 is different than 30% for a household of 2, for example. So no household will be under that 30% for their level. I don't know off the top of my head, the charts are very large. There are a lot of numbers and there are a lot of different steps. So I can't say, a household of 5 will receive X amount of dollars, because there's other factors into that algorithm. But it will just set that floor.
It is about, I think, I'm not sure I'm getting this right, so don't quote me on it, but I think it's somewhere between $100 and $120 a month for a 2-person household right now. But of course, that would change every year as when USDA updates the moderate food plan and JFO updates their budgets as well. So it will shift and change. But it's a significant increase from the $23 a month minimum benefit for a 2-person household.
If Sabina, you could do one more, and I'm sorry, if Sabina doesn't pick your question, please do email it to us because we'd be happy to chat.
So we have one question from Tammy Mosher. She's mentioning that a lot of nonprofits in the region are creating innovative solutions to address food insecurity beyond state programs. Their largest request to help families is providing grocery cards when kids are off school. They play a major role in ending food insecurity. Are there Hunger Free Vermont funds to support local nonprofits? They have received funding for flood relief in their micro communities.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks for being here on our hunger briefing today. So Hunger Free Vermont, we are the only statewide organization that focuses on really leveraging the federal nutrition programs to make a difference with hunger and food insecurity. So we do not provide funding for the kinds of efforts that you are engaged in of purchasing and distributing grocery cards, and that is really important work. There's no denying it, and at the same time, that's not our mission.
Great. Well, being respectful of folks' time, it is just after 11 now. So again, if you do have any other outstanding questions or want to get involved in the Give 3 Squares Vermont a Boost campaign, or have anything else food security related that you want to talk through, please do reach out. Because I could and will talk about this all day if allowed to. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of your work. And I am sure that I will see you all in the State House or on Zoom meetings or on listservs very soon. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And admittedly, Sabina, as the